Normandy, France. July 1944. The dawn broke over a horizon that shimmered with metal. From the hedgerows of Saint-Lô to the smoking ruins of Caen, the fields were crawling, not with men, but with machines. Rows upon rows of tanks, their engines rumbling like a rolling earthquake. The air smelled of oil, dust, and cordite. German panzer crews peered through their optics, disbelieving what they saw. It wasn't just one column, it was hundreds. A flood of Sherman tanks advancing together. Olive-drab giants cutting through mud, crossing rivers, crushing fences beneath their tracks. They had fought tanks before. British Churchills, Soviet T-34s, even the occasional American M3. But never this number. Every hill seemed alive with them. Every valley echoed with the metallic thunder of Detroit's forges. To the German tankers, it felt impossible. How could one nation, across an ocean, build an army of steel so vast, so relentless, that it turned the very landscape into a factory of war? And as the Shermans kept coming, one realization chilled them more than the shells. America hadn't just built tanks. It had built an unstoppable machine. In 1939, when Europe plunged into war, the United States was not ready for global conflict. Its army ranked 17th in the world, smaller than Portugal's. The U.S. possessed only a few hundred tanks, many of them light, outdated, and mechanically fragile. American industry was still climbing out of the Great Depression. But by 1940, the world was changing faster than anyone could imagine. Nazi Germany had conquered most of Europe in under a year, and Britain was standing alone. Across the Atlantic, President Franklin D. Roosevelt understood what that meant. If Britain fell, America would stand alone next. He made a declaration that would change history. In a December 1940 radio address, Roosevelt told the nation, "We must be the great arsenal of democracy." Those 6 words transformed America's destiny. Factories that once built cars, refrigerators, and farm tractors began retooling for war. The automobile plants of Detroit, General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler, became the beating heart of the world's largest military-industrial surge. The tank would become its symbol. By mid-1941, engineers at the U.S. Ordnance Department were racing to design a new medium tank, something faster, simpler, and cheaper than anything before. The goal was clear: mass production. The result was the M4 Sherman. Named after the Union general of the Civil War, the M4 was not the strongest or the thickest armored tank on the battlefield, but it was the most buildable. It used existing car manufacturing techniques. Its engines came from aircraft and truck designs. It could be built by workers who had never touched a tank before. Each one cost less than half of a German Panther and could be assembled in a fraction of the time. It was the embodiment of a new kind of warfare, industrial warfare. By the time the United States entered the war in December 1941, its assembly lines were already roaring. Ford's massive Willow Run plant, the same factory that built B-24 bombers, was retooled to produce tanks at unprecedented rates. Trains left every hour, loaded with Shermans bound for ports on both coasts. America was not just preparing for war, it was preparing to supply the world. Under the Lend-Lease Act, the United States sent tanks, planes, and trucks to Britain, the Soviet Union, and even Free France. Sherman tanks rolled through the deserts of North Africa under British command, fought in the jungles of Burma, and smashed across the Russian steppes in Red Army colors. By 1943, the numbers were staggering. America was building nearly 2,000 tanks a month. German factories, under constant bombing, could not come close. To the Axis, it seemed like an impossible feat, as if the Americans had discovered a way to turn money directly into steel. But to those on the factory floor, it was grueling labor. Day and night, women riveters, immigrant welders, and southern farmhands stood shoulder to shoulder, forging the war machine that would save Europe. By the end of 1943, 1 in every 3 vehicles in the Allied armies bore a single stamp: Made in USA. And still, the production lines did not slow. Every tank that rolled off the assembly line was shipped, tested, and sent into battle. In Africa, in Italy, in the Pacific, and soon in France. Because when the invasion of Europe finally came, America would unleash not just soldiers and ships, but the full might of its factories. The Sherman wasn't built to be perfect. It was built to be there, and that was what would terrify German commanders most. By 1942, the M4 Sherman was no longer an American experiment. It was a global instrument of war. From the deserts of North Africa to the frozen steppes of the Eastern Front, its silhouette became the defining shape of Allied power. In November 1942, the Shermans saw their first major test in Operation Torch, the Allied landings in North Africa. Under the burning Saharan sun, British and American crews drove columns of Shermans into combat against Germany's famed Afrika Korps. Facing Erwin Rommel's Panzer III and I-4 tanks, the Sherman proved itself durable and dependable. It wasn't invincible, no tank was, but it could take a hit, keep moving, and fire back. And when one was destroyed, 3 more were already on the way. For Rommel's forces, who fought with dwindling supplies and replacement parts, this was a nightmare. The Germans were masters of engineering, but their tanks, the Panzer IV, the Panther, and the Tiger, were complex, slow to produce, and nearly impossible to replace in numbers. Each German tank was a masterpiece. Each Sherman was a mass-produced promise. By 1943, Sherman production expanded beyond imagination. Over 49 factories across the United States were manufacturing parts. Turrets in Michigan, hulls in Illinois, engines in California. The logistics were synchronized like clockwork. The Sherman was more than a tank. It was a modular machine. Its interchangeable parts allowed maintenance crews to repair a damaged Sherman in hours, something the Germans couldn't dream of doing. A burned-out Tiger might sit abandoned for weeks, but a Sherman could be stripped for parts and returned to battle within a day. This reliability was what made it indispensable across the Allied fronts. In Italy, the Sherman climbed mountains and rolled through ancient towns where roads barely fit a horse cart. In the Pacific, its tracks crushed coral and mud as it fought through Japanese bunkers in Saipan and Iwo Jima. In Russia, Shermans sent by Lend-Lease carried Soviet Red Stars as they thundered through snow-covered fields toward the Dnieper River. Everywhere it went, soldiers gave it nicknames: Ronson, Tommy Cooker, Old Reliable. Some mocked its tendency to burn when hit, but for the crews who relied on it, the Sherman was home. In late 1943, as plans for Operation Overlord, the invasion of Nazi-occupied France, took shape, one thing became clear: the Sherman would be the spearhead. Tens of thousands of them were lined up in Britain, awaiting the day the English Channel would open. German intelligence was stunned. Their analysts reported the numbers, but even they didn't believe them. Could America truly have built 50,000 tanks in less than 3 years? To German commanders, the figure was absurd, a logistical impossibility, but it was true. Every day, American industry was producing what Germany could not: scale. The Germans had brilliance, the Americans had abundance, and in war, quantity has a quality of its own. The Sherman's arrival marked a new kind of warfare, one where supply chains, factories, and shipping lines were as decisive as any general. Every tank was a statement of intent, that the United States could project power anywhere on Earth, not by sheer genius, but by unrelenting production. As 1944 approached, Europe was a fortress waiting to be stormed. Behind its walls, the Wehrmacht believed their Tigers and Panthers would dominate any battlefield. But on the British coast, the Allies were preparing something the Germans couldn't match. A storm of machines, thousands of Shermans, coated in waterproofing grease, fitted with deep wading gear, and tuned for battle, lined up like silent steel beasts, awaiting the order to advance, and when D-Day came, they would roar to life. From North Africa's dunes to Normandy's hedgerows, the Sherman had become the face of Allied warfighting. But what truly defined it was not its firepower or armor. It was its endless presence. The Germans could destroy a Sherman, but they could never destroy them all. And soon, they would learn what it meant to face an enemy that never ran out of tanks, never ran out of parts, and never ran out of will. The German Tiger was a marvel. It was massive, intimidating, and built like a fortress. Its 80mm gun could knock out a Sherman from over 2 kilometers away. Its armor was so thick that Allied rounds often bounced off harmlessly. Every inch of it was engineered for dominance, precise tolerances, hand-machined parts, and superior optics. But this brilliance came at a cost. Each Tiger took 300,000 man-hours to produce. A single broken transmission could cripple it for weeks. Many were lost not to enemy fire, but to breakdowns, fuel shortages, or bridges that couldn't hold their weight. The Sherman, on the other hand, was not designed to be the best tank. It was designed to be good enough everywhere. Its armor could stop small and medium-caliber shells, its 75mm gun was reliable, and its speed outmatched most German armor. Most importantly, it could be built fast. In the time Germany produced 1 Tiger, the U.S. could build 10 Shermans. The Germans pursued perfection. The Americans pursued production. And in a global war, perfection loses to persistence. The Sherman was the child of an industrial revolution turned to war. America's factories had mastered mass production decades earlier with Henry Ford's assembly line. Now, that same principle was applied to tanks. At the Ford Detroit Tank Arsenal, production lines stretched for miles. Cranes swung steel hulls from one station to the next. Welders stitched plates together, and engines slid into place like clockwork. Every worker, from seasoned machinists to newly trained women, knew their rhythm. By 1944, a new Sherman rolled off the line every 30 minutes. It was no longer about craftsmanship. It was about throughput. The Germans couldn't comprehend it. Their tank factories were smaller, often bombed, and still operated under old guild-like systems. Skilled laborers hand-fitted each component, making interchangeability nearly impossible. When a Tiger needed a new part, it had to come from a specific factory. When a Sherman needed one, any part from any plant would fit. It wasn't just production, it was philosophy. America had turned warfare into an assembly line. A tank is only as good as the men inside it. The Sherman's greatest strength wasn't just its mechanics, it was its learnability. American tank crews could be trained quickly because the M4 was intuitive to operate. Controls were simplified, maintenance was straightforward, and spare parts were abundant. A crew that lost its Sherman could have a new one by the next day, and already know exactly how to fight in it. In contrast, German tankers operated machines that demanded near-engineer levels of expertise. Panthers and Tigers required long, complex training cycles, and their mechanical systems punished even minor errors. When Germany began running short of experienced crews in 1944, its armored divisions suffered catastrophically. America, however, could replace both the tank and the men who drove it at an industrial scale. The Sherman turned armored warfare into something repeatable. A process, not an art, and that made it deadly. The Sherman was everywhere. Its chassis became the backbone for dozens of variants: flamethrowers, recovery vehicles, mine clearers, amphibious DD tanks, and even rocket platforms. Wherever the terrain, the M4 could be modified to fit. In the Pacific, engineers turned Shermans into amphibious assault tanks, fitted with flotation skirts to crawl onto beaches under Japanese fire. In Italy, their wide tracks and climbing torque made them ideal for mountain operations. In Europe, upgraded Shermans, like the Firefly, mounted the powerful British 17-pounder gun, finally able to duel Panthers and Tigers head-on. This adaptability made the Sherman not just a tank, but a platform, a global system of armor. Wherever Allied flags flew, Shermans followed. British, Polish, Canadian, Soviet, Free French, even Chinese units fielded them. It became the world's most common tank, and the most feared. Not for what it was, but for how many there were. By Barrage, 19th to 1944, German commanders began to realize that the battlefield had changed. War was no longer about who had the superior design, but who could keep fighting longer. For every Tiger that rumbled into action, 10 Shermans waited to meet it, and when one fell, another was already being shipped across the Atlantic. That unstoppable tide was what made German tankers whisper in disbelief. 50,000 Shermans. Unmöglich. 50,000 Shermans. Impossible. Every Sherman was home to 5 men: the driver, assistant driver, gunner, loader, and commander. Inside that cramped steel shell, space was tight, heat unbearable, and fear constant. But the Sherman's design offered something rare in wartime machines: comfort through logic. Its interior layout was clean and intuitive. Ammunition was organized, escape hatches were accessible, and visibility was excellent. German tankers inside the cramped Tiger had better protection, but often worse awareness. The Tiger's thick armor gave safety, but its narrow field of view made it blind in close quarters. The Sherman, with its multiple periscopes and a high-mounted commander's cupola, offered a panoramic view. In Normandy's hedgerows, where ambushes waited behind every bush, this visibility saved lives. Many Sherman crews called their tank a rolling coffin, and in truth, casualties were high. But they also knew something crucial. Their tank would get them there. It would start in the morning, run all day, and not break down halfway through the fight. It was dependable, and in war, dependability becomes trust. Trust builds morale. Morale wins campaigns. For the Germans, the experience of facing the Sherman was surreal. Their tank aces, men like Michael Wittmann, had perfected the art of armored warfare. A single Tiger could destroy a dozen Shermans in a day. And in duels, German optics and gun precision reigned supreme. But the problem wasn't the duels. It was everything else. Every time a Tiger destroyed one Sherman, 2 more appeared. Every time a Panther broke down, 3 Shermans drove past it. At first, German crews mocked the M4. They called it a Tommy Cooker for how easily it burned. But as the months dragged on, their tone changed. They began to see that the Sherman wasn't just a tank, it was a system. It represented something Germany could not replicate: a total war economy. By 1944, German tankers found themselves outnumbered 10-1, sometimes more. Even when they held technological superiority, they were overwhelmed by sheer mechanical presence. It was no longer a contest of machines. It was a contest of nations' capacities to endure, and Germany was losing that fight. The Sherman's greatest victory wasn't on the battlefield. It was in the supply lines. Every Sherman used standardized parts, which meant any mechanic in any theater could repair one. Spare engines, transmissions, and even turrets could be swapped without special fitting. American logistics units carried crates of Sherman components across oceans, deserts, and mountains. In France, if a Sherman's gun was destroyed, field workshops could weld on a new barrel in hours. In the Pacific, tanks that were sunk in mud could be stripped, cleaned, and reassembled with salvaged parts. Germany never achieved that flexibility. Its Panthers and Tigers required specialized parts made in bombed-out factories, transported by rail that no longer existed. The Sherman didn't just move on tracks. It moved on infrastructure. An army of ships, trucks, trains, and mechanics followed it everywhere. That was the real power of American industry. Not just building tanks, but keeping them alive. The Sherman was more than a tank. It was a symbol of the 20th century's new kind of war. It represented mass production, global coordination, and industrial power. It turned war into a supply equation. Whoever could build, move, and maintain the most machines would win. German officers, watching thousands of Shermans rolling across Europe, saw more than steel. They saw inevitability. No matter how skilled their crews were, no matter how strong their armor, they were facing an opponent with infinite reach. For every destroyed tank, the Americans sent another. For every factory bombed, 2 more came online. That realization broke something deeper than tactics. It broke morale. By late 1944, German field reports often carried the same bitter line. We killed them all day, but they keep coming. The Sherman had become the embodiment of industrial warfare. Relentless, mechanical, and unending. It was not the best tank in the world. It was the tank that won the world. And as the summer of 1944 turned into the fiery autumn of Europe, those 50,000 Shermans were about to make their defining march across the beaches of Normandy, through the hedgerows of France, and straight toward the heart of Germany itself. Because now, the tide of war was ready to turn. June 6, 1944. The world held its breath at dawn. Over 5,000 Allied ships surged across the English Channel. Behind the gray waves and smoke, hundreds of landing craft carried men, machines, and the weapon that would carry the Allies through France, the M4 Sherman. This was Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious invasion in history, and for the Sherman, it was the beginning of its most important campaign. The first wave hit the beaches of Normandy under relentless fire. German artillery and machine guns cut through the surf. Men fell before they even touched the sand. But among the chaos, something remarkable happened. The Sherman tanks began to emerge from the sea. These were not ordinary tanks. They were the DD Shermans, duplex drive models fitted with collapsible canvas screens and propellers designed to swim. The plan was ambitious. They would launch from the landing ships offshore and drive themselves through the surf to provide fire support on the beaches. Many didn't make it. The sea was too rough. Waves tore the flotation screens apart. Dozens of Shermans sank before they reached land. But the ones that did changed everything. On beaches like Sword, Gold, and Juno, surviving DD Shermans rolled out of the surf like iron sea creatures. Their 75mm guns fired as their treads clawed through the sand. They blasted German bunkers that had pinned down infantry for hours. Infantry units that were moments from annihilation suddenly had cover. Shermans moved up the beach, firing point-blank at concrete pillboxes. Their machine guns raked trenches and gun nests. For the men on the ground, those tanks were salvation. They were living proof that the invasion could succeed. Once the beachheads were secured, the Shermans kept moving. Every port, every hedgerow, every town in Normandy became a battlefield. But now, they were fighting on the Germans' terms. The countryside of Normandy was unlike anything American tankers had seen. Tall hedgerows, thick earthen walls topped with brush, turned every field into a maze. German tanks and anti-tank guns waited in ambush. The Panther, Germany's new medium tank, prowled the fields. Its high-velocity 75mm gun capable of destroying a Sherman before it even saw its attacker. And behind them lurked the Tiger, a monster whose armor could shrug off nearly anything the Sherman could fire. In those first weeks, losses were brutal. Entire platoons of Shermans vanished in ambushes. Tank crews learned to dread the flash of a German gun, because by the time you saw it, you were already dead. Yet, even in the face of such losses, the tide kept moving. Because for every tank the Germans destroyed, more arrived from the coast. Every day, ships unloaded more Shermans. Replacement crews climbed into newly arrived machines and pushed forward without pause. The Germans began calling it the Eiserne Flut, the Iron Flood. It didn't matter how many Tigers they fielded. The Shermans would come again and again. To fight back, American crews learned new tactics. They stopped trying to duel Panthers and Tigers head-on. Instead, they used their speed, coordination, and numbers. While one Sherman drew fire, two more flanked the enemy. Infantry with bazookas and artillery support worked hand in hand. Air support from P-47, Thunderbolts and Typhoons strafed enemy positions. Each battlefield became a demonstration of Allied coordination, a machine made of men, metal, and willpower. By late June, the hedgerows were burning. Every German village was surrounded, cut off, and crushed. The Shermans, once mocked for being underpowered, had become unstoppable through sheer momentum. The Allied advance was methodical, grinding, and unending. The Germans had the better tanks, but they no longer had the initiative. Every time they destroyed one Sherman column, two more appeared down the road. The battlefield had become industrialized. The Germans had built the most advanced tanks in history, but they were still fighting like the 19th century. America was fighting like the future. By July 1944, after 6 weeks of brutal fighting, the breakout began. Operation Cobra, led by General Omar Bradley, unleashed thousands of bombers and artillery pieces, followed by columns of Shermans that smashed through the German lines near St. Lo. In a single day, 600 tanks rolled through the breach. German defenses that had held for weeks collapsed in hours. The Shermans poured through, their engines roaring across the open countryside. The breakout became a pursuit. German divisions tried to regroup, but they couldn't. Their tanks were running out of fuel. Their roads were shattered, and their skies belonged to Allied planes. By the end of August, the Allied forces had liberated Paris. The Iron Flood had reached the gates of the city. The German dream of holding Western Europe was over, and for the first time since 1940, Nazi commanders understood what they were truly facing, not just the might of an army, but the engine of a continent. Because behind every Sherman that rolled through the French countryside, there were hundreds of workers, thousands of supply ships, and an entire nation of industry that refused to stop. The machine had awakened, and it was moving east. August 1944. The German army's Western Front was in chaos. After the breakout from Normandy, American and British forces poured across France. Thousands of Shermans surged forward, forming an unbroken line of armored power. German commanders, once confident in their technologically superior tanks, now faced a stark truth: numbers, coordination, and logistics could overwhelm skill. In the forests and fields of northern France, Panthers and Tigers ambushed Sherman columns whenever possible. Many Shermans were destroyed in spectacular fashion, their thin armor igniting when hit. Yet, every loss was meaningless in the grand calculus of war. For every Sherman destroyed, another 10 were already en route. German radio chatter reflected growing despair. Wir können sie nicht aufhalten. We cannot stop them. The Battle of the Falaise Pocket became the definitive moment. German forces attempted a desperate retreat through narrow corridors. Shermans, backed by infantry, artillery, and air support, encircled them. Panzer divisions were cut off, annihilated, or forced to surrender. German officers wrote later, "We faced not tanks, but a flood, an endless, unceasing flood of Shermans." Mechanically, the Sherman was inferior. Its 75mm gun struggled against the Panther's frontal armor. Strategically, it was invincible. The Americans turned its weaknesses into advantages: speed, maneuverability, and sheer abundance. Even in the Ardennes, during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, the pattern repeated. German forces launched their last major offensive, hoping to split Allied lines. Tigers and Panthers struck hard, destroying dozens of Shermans in the opening days. But the U.S. supply lines ensured replacements arrived almost immediately. By the second week, the Americans had more tanks than before, their momentum unbroken. German tankers noted something chilling. The Sherman's presence was inexhaustible. Their pride in superior machines became frustration, then desperation. Training, experience, and technology were no longer enough to dominate a battlefield governed by relentless production. Allied air superiority compounded the problem. P-47, Thunderbolts and Hawker Typhoons strafed retreating columns, while bombers destroyed bridges and railroads, further restricting German mobility. Shermans followed, using open roads and intact bridges to advance rapidly. In intelligence reports, German command acknowledged that the Sherman wasn't just a tank, it was a system. It represented the industrial capacity of an entire nation, a logistics network that could feed, repair, and replace armored divisions faster than Germany could counter. By early 1945, the Allies crossed the Rhine. The Sherman led the way, in countless columns, in every army, with crews from the U.S., Britain, Canada, Poland, and Free France. They rolled through towns, cities, and forests, crushing resistance that had once seemed invincible. German tanks, however advanced, were outnumbered, outsupplied, and strategically obsolete. The very qualities that made German armor legendary: heavy armor, long-range guns, complex engineering, had become liabilities in a war of attrition and industrial scale. The realization struck German commanders hard. The Sherman was not the tank to fear in isolation, but in quantity, coordination, and endurance. 50,000 units, and counting, represented a war they could not win, regardless of battlefield genius. By the time Allied forces entered Germany, many German tank crews surrendered without a fight. Some destroyed their Tigers and Panthers to avoid capture, but the truth remained. The Sherman, the mass-produced medium tank, had carried the weight of an entire industrialized democracy across Europe. The Iron Flood had reached Berlin. German reports later reflected on the psychological impact. We could fight them, kill them, destroy them, but they never ended. It was not the tank we feared. It was the nation behind it. The Sherman's campaign was more than a series of battles. It was proof that industrial output, logistical planning, and production philosophy could redefine war. By April 1945, the war in Europe was ending. Shermans entered Berlin, linking the Atlantic and Eastern fronts. They were no longer just tanks. They were a symbol of what American industry could achieve. For German tankers, the lesson was clear. Technology alone does not win wars. Numbers, coordination, and relentless production can. And the Sherman had proven it, again and again, across every battlefield, every front, every challenge. With Germany's surrender in May 1945, the battlefield became a graveyard of machines. Across Europe, shattered Panthers and burned-out Tigers littered roads and fields. But for every German tank destroyed, dozens of Shermans remained operational, a testament to American production and logistics. The numbers tell the story. By the end of the war, the United States had produced over 49,000 Sherman tanks. Germany, by contrast, had managed just over 6,000 Panthers and Tigers combined. The disparity was staggering. One German general, reviewing captured records, noted with disbelief, "They have 50,000 tanks." 50,000! No force in history has moved like this. It wasn't just quantity, it was sustainability. Shermans could be repaired and returned to combat within hours. German tanks, when damaged, often became permanent losses. The battlefield attrition favored America not because of superior firepower, but because the Shermans kept coming. The Sherman's legacy extended beyond its mechanical reliability. It reshaped Allied strategy. Commanders could plan offensives with confidence, knowing that armored units could be replaced as quickly as they were lost. Entire campaigns, such as Operation Cobra and the Battle of the Bulge, relied on this industrial edge. Without it, breakthroughs would have been far riskier, casualties higher, and German counterattacks potentially decisive. Soldiers on both sides recognized the psychological effect. German crews feared the endless waves. American crews trusted that their backup would arrive. Morale, reinforced by industrial might, became a decisive weapon. The tank also left a technological and logistical blueprint for the future. Armies worldwide realized that war was no longer just a contest of tactics and design. It was a contest of production, supply chains, and repair networks. The Sherman had demonstrated that speed, simplicity, and abundance could triumph over technical superiority. By the time peace returned to Europe, the Sherman was everywhere, in occupation zones, in museums, in photographs, and in soldiers' memories. It was no longer just a vehicle. It was a symbol of the industrialized democratic war effort. The end of the war did not end the Sherman story. Its impact reverberated across continents and decades. As the Allies disassembled the remnants of the German war machine, they also studied the mechanics of victory. The Sherman had become a benchmark for post-war armored doctrine. In Europe, former Allied nations incorporated the M4 into their post-war armies. France, Poland, and Britain relied on Shermans to stabilize occupied territories. The tank was rugged, adaptable, and easily maintained, perfect for nations rebuilding militarily after the war. Across the Atlantic, the United States analyzed lessons learned. The Sherman proved that industrial capacity and logistical superiority were decisive forces, sometimes more so than technological innovation. Military planners concluded that future conflicts would demand not just skilled engineers and elite troops, but the ability to produce, transport, and sustain entire mechanized armies. The tank also fought again, decades later. During the Korean War, Shermans were sent to the front lines, often facing more modern tanks. Despite their age, the design's simplicity, reliability, and maintainability kept them in the fight. Other nations, including Israel, upgraded Shermans with heavier guns and armor for conflicts in the 1950s and 1960s. On the German side, post-war reflections highlighted the strategic failure of focusing too narrowly on technological perfection. German tankers acknowledged that even the most powerful vehicles could be rendered irrelevant if the opponent could replace losses faster, supply fuel and ammunition consistently, and maintain operational readiness across multiple fronts. Historians later noted that the Sherman's victory was a product not of battlefield brilliance alone, but of a nationwide system of production and distribution. It embodied a broader principle of modern warfare, that a country's industrial base is as much a weapon as its armies. The psychological impact on German troops was lasting. Diaries and post-war interviews repeatedly referenced the sheer scale and relentlessness of Sherman columns. The term Eiserne Flut, the Iron Flood, became emblematic of the overwhelming presence that had crushed German hopes in France, Belgium, and beyond. By 1946, while the Sherman would gradually be retired from frontline service, its lessons endured. Modern armored doctrine increasingly emphasized balance over perfection. Lighter, easier to produce vehicles that could be fielded in large numbers without sacrificing reliability. The Sherman was more than a tank. It was a mechanical ambassador of industrial democracy, a testament to the idea that national capacity, organization, and relentless production could reshape history. In the end, 50,000 Shermans had done more than win battles. They had redefined what it meant to wage war, forcing Germany to confront a reality in which ingenuity without scale could not secure victory.